Okay. So that's our beginning. This year that we have just begun, I think this is our third Sunday into 2024. And the last year that we had was called 2023. So I just found this video that I thought don't mind the noise. But that is a man who actually was reminding us that there was a year which was called 2023, which is not going to come back, of course. And there is now a new year, which is now called 2024. So he was removing a 3 there, as you saw. Let's take that again. He was removing a 3 again. And he is saying goodbye. So he has actually put a 4. Why did I start from there? Because we actually have a tendency, people actually have a tendency, whenever the year comes to an end. That is another artist who is actually trying to compare the 2 years, 2023, 2024, and according to his perspective, there is no difference. And I tend to agree with him that there is no difference. The only difference is what we saw, taking away a 3, throwing it away, and putting a 4. Otherwise, everything else remains the same. But we actually always have a tendency of making resolutions. Some of them are never followed up. Some perhaps are going to be followed up. And some just are thrown in the dustbin the moment they are actually made. So this morning, I actually want to suggest one of the resolutions. If we have already made resolutions for the year 2024, I'm actually trying to suggest one of the resolutions. If you have not yet added it to your resolutions, I would ask you to actually add this one, because I think the moment you add this one, it's actually going to help you go forward, particularly from the perspective of yourself being a Christian. So I'm actually going to suggest a resolution, and that resolution is associated with this question, or the resolution is actually for you to ask yourself this question: what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? In fact, this is exactly what was read to us just now from the book of Matthew, chapter 27. If you have time, turn with me to the book of Matthew, chapter 27. We are going to quickly take the reading again from verse 15, and we are going to end on verse 23. Matthew chapter 27, verse 15 up to verse 23. I'm going to take it from the English Standard Version. Verse 15 says, "Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, 'Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ?' For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, 'Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream.' Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them, 'Which of the two do you want me to release for you?' And they said, 'Barabbas.' Pilate said to them, 'Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?' They all said, 'Let him be crucified.' And he said, 'Why? What evil has he done?' But they shouted all the more, 'Let him be crucified.'" In quick succession between verse 15 and verse 23, we are going to see Pilate asking at least 4 questions that are actually there. Jesus is actually, this is the background. Jesus has been brought to him because Judas has just betrayed Jesus. So Jesus has been brought to him. They have just arrested Jesus. In fact, they dragged him to the courts. And Pilate is the one that is going to be presiding over this court. But we are also told, if you read the same account in Luke chapter 23, Luke is also going to tell us that he was taken to Pilate, then he was also taken to Herod Antipas, then he was brought back to Pilate. So this must have been the second time that he has been brought to Pilate. And now the case that they are, putting before him is now intensifying. So Pilate is going to ask 4 questions at least. But one of those questions is very important, which I want you and me to ask this morning, and we are going to try and ask this question forever and ever. What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? That's the question which Pilate asked in Matthew chapter 22. They want him to be crucified. This is the Jews. So when he asked them the question, what am I going to do with Jesus? They said, crucify him. So he actually gave them an option, because in prison there was another man who was called Barabbas. Bar-Abbas. That means son of Abbas. Bar, B-A-R, means son of Abbas. So this Pilate is going to come to them and say, who should I release? Bar-Abbas, who is in jail, who is also son of Abbas. Who should I release between those two, son of Abbas and the son of man? They are actually going to choose son of Abbas at the expense of the son of man. That is Christ. So they are going to say, crucify him, crucify him. So Pilate asked them a question and said, what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? That's the question which I want you to ask. But as we move on, I just want us to give some little bit of background to who Pilate was. The first question is, who was Pilate? Of course, we know that he was a Roman governor. At this particular time in history, Rome is actually in charge of the entire world, at least the known world at the time, including all the Mediterranean area. So Rome is controlling that whole area. But of importance, the Rome was also controlling Palestine, which was, of course, the citadel of the Jews. We know at this particular time that earlier on, the Jews had actually separated. The 2 kingdoms, Judah remained to the south, and of course Israel moved to the north. But this whole area is actually being controlled by Pilate. Pilate was actually somebody who had been designated by the Roman emperor, or the Roman Empire at the time. Pilate was actually known as the governor. In fact, history tells us that Pilate became the 5th governor. We don't know of the first 4, but we only know of Pilate as the governor. So this whole area was being ruled initially by Herod the Great. But when Herod the Great died, it was actually divided into 3 and it was given to his sons. One of his sons was Archelaus, who took Judea, and he was responsible for Judea. But because of some reason, the emperor at the time was not happy with what he was doing. So the king was removed. That was Herod Archelaus. Right there in Galilee and Perea, there was Herod Antipas, and of course up there was Herod Philip. So Archelaus, when he was removed, the emperor from Rome decided that he was not going to put a king anymore in Judea. Rather, he was going to put a governor who was directly appointed from Rome. So Pilate was the 5th of those governors. At the time of Jesus' crucifixion, this is the man that was in charge. But what was important about this man, who had been appointed by Caesar Tiberius at the time, he was in charge of Judea, and he was enforcing the Roman laws. But of course, he was not enforcing the Jewish laws. He had nothing to do with the Jewish laws. He had nothing to do with their religious laws. In fact, he was actually enforcing the political laws of Rome. So, if the Jews wanted somebody to die, they didn't have power themselves to kill somebody or to cause somebody to die. They had to go to the governor and lay their charges, so that the governor is going to decide whether this charge which has been given before him, whether it warrants somebody to die or not. So they dragged Jesus to him, and they are accusing Jesus of claiming to be a king. But of course, Pilate is not going to understand, because most of the accusations were emanating from their religious laws. So he was not interested in that. So at the end of the day, Pilate discovered that these people were bringing Jesus out of jealousy, not really because he had committed an offense. So he wanted to let him go. But of course, he could not let him go, because the Jews were holding a very tight grip on him. In fact, if you read the same account in the book of John, in John 18 and John 19, you are actually going to see that they actually put Pilate in a corner. They put him in a corner in the sense that Pilate was supposed to be enforcing the law of the Romans. And there was only one king who was accepted, who was the emperor who resided in Rome. So if anybody else claimed to be a king, and his claim was going to challenge the kingship of the emperor, that person was supposed to be punished, or that person was supposed to be punished somehow. So in fact, what Jews are going to do is, all this time, they didn't like the Roman emperor. All this time, they didn't respect him. But for the sake of Jesus to die, they actually came and put Pilate in a corner and said, this man is claiming to be a king. So what he is doing is either he is equating himself to the emperor, Caesar, or he is actually putting himself above Caesar. So when Pilate wanted him to go, he also ran a risk, because if he let Jesus go, and the emperor heard about him letting somebody who was claiming to be king going, that actually was going to also cause a punishment on Pilate. So they are going to put him in a corner, and of course Pilate eventually is going to wash his hands, and he's going to allow Jesus to die. So as we are asking ourselves this question, what shall I do with Jesus? Let's discover some more information. So that will be Pilate. Unfortunately, my information is not always. Let me see if we can put everything in. Okay. So I've come up with a certain diagram here that I want you and me to go through together. So this is what is happening. There is this man who is called Pilate, who was the governor. So the Jews have come with Jesus and they've handed him over to Pilate. And they've accused him of all sorts of things. But most importantly, they are saying this man is claiming to be a king. Yet we only have one king. That's what they say in John chapter 19. We only have one king, and that king is Caesar. Even though inward they knew that they didn't like Caesar. You remember at some point when Jesus was still walking and teaching them, they asked him a question and said, are we allowed to pay? Is it lawful for us to pay a tribute to Caesar? And of course Jesus said, pay Caesar what belongs to Caesar. They didn't like that because they thought there was going to be a king who was coming, who was going to stop them from paying anything to Caesar, because they didn't like him. So in this particular case, because they want Jesus to die, they are actually going to seem as if and claim and pretend as if they wanted a king and they loved the king Caesar. So Pilate is going to be put in a corner. So there is Pilate there and there is Jesus. But I have put you and me on the other side. And I want us to see what is happening here. So Pilate, on the day when he asked the question, what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? He was asking that question because Pilate wanted to serve Jesus. So Pilate is asking the question, the reason why he's going to give a proposal, should I release Barabbas or Jesus? If they had said to release Jesus, this is exactly what Pilate wanted. In fact, his wife in her dream, she actually dreamt something that was very strange about Jesus. And she sent a message to Pilate while he was presiding over this case. And she said to him, never have anything to do with that man, because I had a troubled dream about him. Pilate was without any doubt, knowing that Jesus had not committed any offense. This is why he wanted to let Jesus go. So Pilate wanted to serve Jesus. So he's going to ask a question, what shall I do with Jesus who also is called Christ? He wanted them to say, release him, so that he would serve him. But he would serve him from what? He wanted to serve Jesus, and he wanted to serve him from dying. So if Pilate had stamped his authority, Jesus would not have died. But he would have actually run into trouble himself as well, because Jesus was claiming to be a king according to the Jews. So by so doing, he is usurping the authority of Caesar. So he has to die. So Pilate is trying, by all means, to serve Jesus. He wants to serve him, and he wants to serve him from dying. Why have I put you there, and why have I put myself in there? Because we are basically doing exactly the same. In fact, it might be different, but we are still trying to serve Jesus somehow. So you and me, this is what we are trying to do. There is you, there is me, who are trying to serve Jesus. And why do we want to serve Jesus? We want to serve Jesus so that Jesus is going to serve us. And he's going to save us from dying. You see those arrows. Let's begin from the beginning. I want you to follow the arrows. Pilate wanted to serve, S-A-V-E. He wanted to serve Jesus. He wanted to save him from dying on the day, so that Jesus would not be crucified. But you and me, we are serving Jesus. But we are not serving S-A-V-E. We are serving Jesus, S-E-R-V-E. And we are serving Jesus so that Jesus is going to S-A-V-E, to save you and to save me from death. Let's move on. So I proposed in the beginning that we have to ask ourselves this question: what shall I do with Christ? Or what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? Let's go back to the book of Matthew and add on some information on this. So in verse 21, the governor again said to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? They all said, let him be crucified. And again he said, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. You know, it's interesting to me that if you really go, if it was on the day, if we knew the identity of these people who are saying, let him die, let him be crucified, I'm pretty sure that some of these people, he had been there when they saw Jesus saving a lot of people from trouble. There are so many people that were living with demons. Jesus had driven those demons away. There are so many people that had seen Jesus, healing those that had different problems. Those that had lepers, he actually healed them. Those that could not walk, he healed them. Those that were blind, he healed them. Some that were deaf and dumb, he actually healed them. The majority of these people saw Jesus doing that, and they acknowledged that this man was doing extraordinary work, extraordinary miracles that they themselves could not do, that they themselves had never done before. They acknowledged that. But when it came on the day, because of mob psychology, the elders are actually going to influence everybody. When Pilate is going to ask the question, what shall I do with Christ? In fact, they are actually going to say, let him be crucified. Many of them are going to give their vote, let him be crucified. But I want you to notice something in this question that Pilate asked. What shall I do? What shall I do with Jesus? He did not end there. In fact, this is to me key. That is key to you and key to me as well. What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? Why do I think this is key? This is key because this is where salvation is. Salvation is actually in the sense that this Jesus, who was born by Mary, is actually Christ. At the time, the name Jesus was just a name. In fact, it was just one of those common names that were given to several of the boy children that were born at the time. So Jesus was just a Jewish name, which really was not important, so to speak. But what then would be important, which would differentiate this Jesus, who was the son of Mary, to their Jesuses, is this title that this man was also called Christ. In fact, when Pilate is asking this question, he is reminding them that this Jesus that you want us to crucify, he is not Jesus, just a Jesus. In fact, he is the Christ, the same person that you have been waiting for since the time of your forefathers. They were waiting for a Messiah who was actually going to come. That is Messiah in the Old Testament in Hebrew, and Christ in the New Testament in Greek. Now that the Messiah has come, you want him to die. Why? What evil has he done? And if you think about it, if you take it closer to you and me now, we perhaps need a Pilate to actually come and ask us the same question: what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? Because ourselves, the Jews, who are supposed to be benefiting from this Christ, they just can't benefit. In fact, they needed somebody, a Gentile, to come and remind them and say, hey, this person is actually the Christ that you were waiting for. So you actually need to worship him because he is going to serve you. And that actually happens today. We are not an exception as Christians. There are times that we actually need somebody who is not even a Christian, somebody who is a non-believer, to remind us that, hey, come on, you are actually a Christian. What shall you do with this Christ? Because he is your Savior. We forget. Why is it that we need somebody to remind us? because we would have forgotten that Christ is supposed to be served by us. In fact, we have to serve him so that he actually also serves us, and he saves us from death, from dying. Somebody is going to ask a question and say, we have seen so many people that are actually, living without worshiping Christ, without dying. What death are you talking about? And of course, we all know that what we are aiming at is actually not, we are all going to die. In fact, it's another reminder when a year changes. I think that also should remind us that we are actually coming closer and closer. In fact, I was talking about this with somebody in December. And I was saying we always celebrate the new year. But in fact, the new year is actually a signal that we are actually coming closer and closer to our graves. And he said, no, don't say that. Don't talk about that. Because we always fear death. But I always find inspiration from Paul. When he wrote the letter to the Philippians in chapter 1, Paul actually said to them, to die, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. I asked myself a question and say, how can Paul say dying is gain? What do you gain by dying? Paul knew what he was talking about. Elsewhere, when he wrote to Timothy, he actually said to Timothy, I have run my race. What is remaining in me is only for me to die. I'm being poured out like old wine, so that when I get there, I am actually going to get the accolade that I was running for when I was in this life. We always forget that when we are living in this life, we are actually transiting to God. We are actually transiting, going to Christ. Hence, we need to ask ourselves the question, what shall I do with him? Because if death were to come now, am I prepared to go and face him? What shall I do with him so that when I die, physically, die in this body, am I ready to go and face him? And can I be so energetic in saying this, like what Paul said, to die is gain, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. In fact, he goes on in the book of Philippians and says to the Philippians, I would want to die today. In fact, to me it's better, because if I die today, then I'm going to be with Jesus. I would have passed through all these troubles of this world, and I'm going to be living comfortably with Jesus. However, for your sake, Paul said, I would rather survive in flesh, because then he wanted to get more time to go and associate with them, to go and teach them. But Paul was ready. He wanted to die. This is the very Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 and 2, who actually says to his readers and his followers, I want you to follow me as I follow the example of Christ. Paul was ready because he knew that there is something good that he had done with Christ. Ask yourself a question, what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? What I am doing, what I was doing in 2023, what I am going to do going forward in 2024, and many, many other years that God is going to bless me with. What am I doing with him? Not just a Jesus, because there were many, many people that were called Jesuses. Even in our day-to-day, we actually know several people that are actually having the name Jesus. Those are not the Jesuses that we are actually talking about. The Jesus that we are actually talking about is this Jesus who is called Christ. And we should ask ourselves a question and say, what am I going to do with him? Am I prepared to go and serve him even much better? Of course, this message is to the two groups of people that always live. Either you are a believer or you are not. Either you are a Christian or you are not a Christian. If you are a Christian, you still need to ask yourself a question, what shall I do with Christ? What is it that I have been doing in my Christian life which I need to amend? Is there anything else that I have not done in the right way which I need to change? Is there any way that I need to improve in person as a Christian as I am serving him? If you find any way where you are supposed to improve, then you need to improve, because you need to know your weaknesses and your strength. But if you are not a Christian and you are not a believer, the message still is for you, because Christ still needs to be worshipped. Because this is the very Christ that we are going to face on the day of judgment. What are you going to do with him? Are you going to continue in the life of being a non-Christian, yet you actually have the opportunity to be in him? You also need to self-introspect and make a decision, and a very bold decision. What are you going to do with Christ? I want to leave you with this question, and I want ourselves to ask ourselves this question: what shall I do? In fact, this was the first part of my introduction to this lesson, what shall I do with Christ? Next week, I actually have another second part where I am actually helping ourselves to identify some of the things that are going to be impediments, definitely in 2024, that are going to prevent us from executing this question. I know it's simple, it's easy for everybody to ask the question, what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? But that's not what is important. What is important is for me to ask the question and then take the necessary measures, take the necessary steps towards correcting wherever I want to correct. So next week, we are actually talking about some of the things that are going to prevent us from correcting where we are supposed to correct. In fact, Exodus chapter 3 is going to be the chapter that is going to help us get some of the things that are supposed to be taken out of our way in this 2024 and all the years to come. But in the meantime, let's continue to ask ourselves this question: what shall I do with Christ, with Jesus, who is also called Christ? Because for the last time, this Jesus, Pilate on the day wanted to save Jesus from death because he thought he had the authority to save him from dying. But in fact, this Pilate still needs this Jesus, because this Jesus is the Christ who is going to judge everybody, including the emperor at the time, including Pilate himself, including all the Jews who were raising their voices and saying, crucify him, crucify him. This is the Jesus. They did not realize that they were supposed to save this Jesus. Not this self, but this self. However, you and me are supposed to serve him, to be in service for him, and of course, so that him, Jesus, is actually going to save us, you and me, from that. If we realize this diagram, then it will actually help us answer the question better. What shall I do with Christ? If I realize that Christ is going to save me, I have to serve him for him to save me from death. Then I'm actually going to do better and behave better in the 2024 and all the other years coming. In the meantime, let's continue asking the question, what shall I do with Christ, with Jesus, who also is called Christ? Thank you very much for listening. I hope for today I will stop there, and we are going to try and pick it up again next week with the last installment of this lesson, what shall I do with Christ? But as I have already said, next week we are going to be identifying some of the things that are always going to be stumbling blocks as we are actually trying to correct our positions after having asked the question, what shall I do with Jesus, who also is called Christ? Thank you so much for being here.